like to know about?
I was just going to ask a connected question, really.
Yeah.
What is the attitude generally of the legal profession locally, the law society and such like, in terms of supporting discrimination legislation? And do legal firms locally in Jersey make efforts to include their staff and train their staff?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Two-part question there. So the legal profession generally, I'm sure, like any new laws, let's be honest, because that is their bread and butter. But aside from that, you know, the lawyers that I've spoken to, they see legislation, social legislation in particular, as a necessary way to change hearts and minds. Because, you know, even if you look at the way we've evolved compared to Guernsey, you know, Guernsey, they're very much for having disability legislation, discrimination legislation. They have very little at the moment. They've made the decision to do it, but they still don't have legislation in place. So whilst the will is there, without the legislation to enforce it, it's just goodwill, and that's all it is. So I would say, by and large, the lawyers locally embrace any new legislation and want to make sure that people, you know, carry cases forward and get, if it is appropriate, any penalties or any apologies that they deserve. And the second part of your question was, training. So yeah, during the presentation I mentioned that employers are vicariously liable for the conduct of their staff. Really important that all employers train their staff, are aware of what they should be doing. So much of it is about good customer service, but so much of it is about treating people with dignity and respect. And from what I can see, that is starting to filter through now. I think, you know, so many companies operate in the UK and in Jersey, and all that good practice automatically filters through. But there are still lots of employers locally, of course, that don't have that benefit of the UK view. So, yeah, this is part of the reason for campaigns like this, is to make everyone aware. Thank you. Any other questions?
I'll mention a case which I brought recently to the Employment Tribunal. It hasn't been as reported as yet, people will see it. It's Price against Falkland Fisheries Market Limited. An important decision because we're fleshing out the disability aspect of the legislation.
Yeah.
What we're beginning to see are the deficiencies of drafting of the legislation and the confusions between the equality law in the United Kingdom, which often has many provisions which assist, which have been omitted in the Jersey legislation.
Yeah.
I think with time we will see this working its way through, but not necessarily to the benefit of the disabled. Decisions are being orientated towards what is the best interests of employers, unfortunately. Awards are very low. The going rate for hurt and distress for someone who's discriminated against is around about £1,000. The legislation says maximum of £5,000. £1,000 is not a deterrent in any sense to a discriminating employer that can run with that. There are details coming out in the legislation which we're going to find are not positive. But the definition of disability itself has now been defined in a recent case.
Yeah.
And that has produced a very low bar, which is great.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
You did.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Nick. I think what happens is the legislation is consulted on and drafted and comes into being, and that isn't the end of it. You know, the legislation can still be tweaked, can still be improved. The tribunal is you know, that case just is a great benchmark to let employers in particular in that case know where they need to be in terms of what disability actually is. Right at the beginning, I spoke about how ours is a social model compared to the UK, which is a medical model, because in the UK they very often spend the first 2 days of a tribunal arguing about whether or not a case is within scope, because obviously the defence is it does not fit into the medical model, and hopefully we won't have those arguments to that extent in Jersey.
Unfortunately, I've got 2 cases on the go at the moment where the employers are absolutely insistent that the person is not disabled. And I think that's going to become a feature of cases in the future.
Yeah.
That defence lawyers, acting for employers, are going to not accept someone who's disabled.
And you know, and that is the ploy that they've taken from the UK, because that's exactly the way that that's their first line of defence, is to try and knock it out that way. Like you say, we've got a low bar. As long as the tribunal continues to apply it sensibly, then hopefully, you know, people who have claims that are genuine will be brought forward and will be successful. Brilliant, thank you for that. Any other questions?
The nature of the business and the income of the business. We've been looking at our premises, which is a 2-storey building, about what we can do to make it more accessible.
Yeah.
And one of the things was a lifting platform.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the construction of the building actually prohibits us to actually do it on financial grounds purely. It take out our entire reserves.
Yeah.
Is there any further guidance in relation to that?
Yeah, so, you know, reasonableness of the adjustment is always going to be a great big grey area. All we could really advise you on that is, if you've made that consideration, hopefully it's well documented, and you've considered what the financial cost is against, you know, how achievable that would be, keep all that documentation so that if you get a complaint, you can say this is why we're not doing it, and this is why in our minds we've been able to justify that decision. And of course, just because that decision is made doesn't mean it shouldn't be reviewed on a regular basis in case things have changed, in case that work suddenly becomes a whole lot cheaper with new technology or whatever. And also, is there another way of servicing those people without having access to the second floor? You know, if you've got 2 floors and actually there's no reason for people who come into the building to go to the second floor, then you probably don't have too much of a problem. If there is something on the second floor, can you bring that down to that person so that they are not disadvantaged by not being able to get to that floor? So some of it might be remodelling what you have over what floor, and some of it might be we can't remodel, we can't build a platform because the cost is prohibitive. Make sure you've documented that decision.
Yes, the Social Security Minister has been given a disability role, which isn't very clear. Maybe you can explain a bit more about what her role is going to be or supposed to be. And I note that 2 officers have been appointed.
Yep.
Now, can you tell us anything about how they fit in with this? Are they going to be proactive? Are they going to be encouraging people to take cases, or what's their role?
Yeah, my understanding is that those 2 roles are going to be to promote, first and foremost, to help implement the disability strategy, which has been formulated alongside this legislation. So there's an overarching strategy to, you know, do things like make the countryside more accessible, you know, to make sure that people don't miss out on opportunities. So those roles are going to be, as far as I understand, very proactive, and they're going to be one of education and one of awareness, as well as informing people of their rights and responsibilities. So they're going to be working with the community in its wider sense, through charitable organisations and through business, to promote awareness and help. And the only bit I'm not too sure about, Mike, is whether they would actually help someone to take a case to tribunal, but they would certainly understand the process.
Because one of the falling down aspects about the legal profession, for however wonderful lawyers might be, is that the legal aid system is very deficient as far as tribunals are concerned.
Yeah.
So if you do take on a case, and if you want to employ a lawyer, you're going to be paying for yourself, which may be...
Yeah. So at Citizens Advice, we will offer low-level help, it's fair to say. You know, we don't represent people at tribunals, but we will offer low-level help for someone to assemble their packs and advise them of what the process is and what they're likely to encounter. But beyond that, we can only equip people with the tools. We can't actually take it forward ourselves. Yes, very often, you know, one of the things which in discrimination law in general is always one of the exemptions. But again, so some of this is discrimination law as a whole. So if you look at, and we don't have religion and belief just yet, but if we've got religion and belief in the future, you'll have things like faith schools who would, you know, probably favour people of a particular faith. And how's that going to fit with religion and belief? Are you then disadvantaging someone who's not from that particular religion? So there's a whole argument to be had there. So many of these things, they bring up as many questions as they do answers, and they just get people thinking, you know, in the round about how the legislation works in practice.
Mine was about exceptions. Can you go back to that one?
Yeah.
And just go through that a bit more.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, some of these are, you know, they're not usually black and white. There's always going to be points to argue for and against. But things like pension schemes, you know, if you look at discrimination law as a whole, when it comes to age discrimination, of course, there's very good reason why you would discriminate against someone on the grounds of their age for a pension scheme, and sometimes it's to protect other people who are investing into the scheme. But with any of these things, you've got to be able to justify why you're exempt from this part of the legislation. So that's a very easy one that lots of people can get their heads around. Insurance is another one. So, you know, insurance companies, if I'm looking at age again, will load younger people's premiums on their car insurance. And as long as they can justify through an audit that a younger person is more likely to have an accident than someone who's been driving for 10, 15 years, then they're able to do that. They did come unstuck in the UK recently where they tried to load younger male drivers as opposed to younger female drivers. And the data actually wasn't as robust as you might think it was. We tend to think of younger males, and the term that the media like to use is boy racers. The fact is, you know, younger drivers across the board tend to be more susceptible to low-level accidents, just because it's usually inexperience, isn't it?
Can't we also justify discrimination on for travel insurance if you've
Yep.
got a disability?
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. So,
Or an illness?
yeah, exactly. So that is down to risk.
Yeah.
And it's you know, any premium will be loaded if there's a particular risk. I think where they push the boat a bit is some insurance companies will just omit that altogether. And you know, COVID-19 is a good example, isn't it? Travel insurance, most travel insurance completely omit COVID-19. I think there's probably an opportunity there for an insurance company who wants to take that risk on, probably at a higher premium, but at least offer it as a policy. Whereas at the moment, you know, all the policies that I've seen is big red writing. COVID-19 is not covered in this policy, and of course, because at the moment the risk is through the roof.
You can also be loaded for, you know, cancer which has been cured.
Yeah.
You know, and you say, well, why is my premium for a week's holiday in Italy bumped up because I had cancer 10 years ago?
Yeah.
And even if I get it again when I'm on holiday, it doesn't make any difference, is it?
Yeah. No,
So, but they would say, no, you know, it's, you know, because you had cancer 10 years ago, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So again, you know, it does take people to push against that to actually get it changed. And some of the big stated cases that you'll see quite often are against insurance companies who've just got a policy that they're applying in a blanket way. And it very often does take an individual to actually rail against it and bring a case and say, justify that. And if they can't, then they will come unstuck. But, you know, let's be honest, it's a it's a road that you want to go down if you're well equipped to do it, and you know, have the time and the effort. But there is lots of support out there for people that do really want to take those cases forward.